if you were to put together a profile of folks who are most likely to deconvert, statistically speaking, they would be people who tend to be a bit above average in intelligence, have at least some university education, that they are tolerant of ambiguity, so they don't feel like they have to take a hard position on certain issues. They would be people who have a low tolerance for like a right wing sort of authoritarian structure. They would be folks who are open to experience. That's a personality trait that we all have that doesn't seem to change over time. And for whatever reason, those folks are the people who would most likely deconvert if you're just looking at things statistically. And and if they're in a group in a church setting where they have almost the polar opposite going on, that might even cause them to be more frustrated and maybe even sort of speed up the exit process for them.
I want to sell you guys something, and here's what I want to sell you. I want to sell you the fact that what John has described in the deconversion world and in the deconstruction world both can be dealt with in a positive way in Christian culture with the following thesis.
When people ask me about inerrancy, I say I believe in it. I just don't know what it means.
Hello, everyone. You're on The Disciple Dilemma. I'm Dennis Allen with my co-host Raymond Monroe. We want to talk about two words today. One of them, deconversion. The other one, deconstruction. And what in the world do those have to do with Christianity and followers of Christ? Is it possible Christians can do deconversion? Is it possible I can be a Christian and deconstruct? Well, professor, author, pastor, husband, and dad John Marriott joins us today to talk about those two words in two of his books. One, The Anatomy of Deconversion. Two, his just released book, Set Adrift, co-authored with apologist, author, and Professor Sean McDowell on the subject of deconstruction. And is that a good thing? John's on faculty at Harvard University as an affiliate with the Human Flourishing Program. He's also the Director of Cultural Engagement at the Renaissance Forum in Los Angeles and the coordinator for Biola's Centers for Christian Thought. Man, this guy is busy. Along with that, John teaches philosophy and anthropology at Biola, and he teaches on staff at Talbot Theological Seminary, which is where he received his PhD on the very subject of deconversion from Christianity to atheism. John has five books out now. Two we'll talk about today, and a sixth one in the cook for 2024. We'll talk about that later as well. His website, johnmarriott.org. So let's get into these two subjects, deconversion and deconstruction. Here we go.
Folks, I am delighted to welcome Dr. John Marriott, who has a fantastic resume that I just described to you a minute ago, and I think it took me 3 minutes to get through this thing. John, thank you for joining us today on The Disciple Dilemma.
Oh, my pleasure. Really glad to be here. Thank you for what you guys are doing and for the interest in what I'm doing.
Well, Raymond, it's not often we get to deal with some guy who's got 5 books on the table and one in the oven cooking for 2024, plus his ability to be at a Christian Thought Center. But I sure am glad you're the other PhD in the room to help me interpret what all you smart guys are saying.
Yeah, it should be fun. Should be fun.
John, I'm just thinking about using your name and going to John chapter 6, verse 66. At this point, many disciples no longer follow Jesus. And I'm thinking that statement somehow connects to Derrida, the philosopher, and a whole lot of work that you've done. I'm kind of thinking about the overload for our people today and trying to simplify this down as a podcast to say there's a number of books John's written. But when I think about the question behind anatomy of deconversion, we've got theoretically disciples of Christ walking off the field here. Can you make some sense out of the word deconversion? And then later on today, we'll talk about deconstruction. But what in the world is it you're looking at with the book Anatomy of Deconversion? What is that?
Sure. So when I use the word deconversion, I'm using it mainly in a sociological kind of a way. I'm not trying to make a decision or determine whether or not someone has committed apostasy, walked away from the faith, renounced their belief in Jesus, pulled themselves out of the church, and have become unjustified, right? I'm not making a theological claim that people who once were Christians can somehow throw away their faith and become unsaved. What I am saying is, in the book, The Anatomy of Deconversion, which is my dissertation put into more popular writing, is that there are a lot of people who do say, at one point in my life, I identified as a follower of Jesus. I had a conversion experience. I was committed to the faith. I went to church. I had a high view of the Bible, but I don't believe any of that anymore. And I've turned and I've renounced it. So if you convert, you adopt all of those things. When you deconvert, you let all of those things go. Now, were those people ever born again to begin with? That's an entirely another, different question that I'm sure that we may touch on. And I know that your ministry is deeply concerned with. But I would say right at the very beginning, whether or not those folks were born again or not, the very same issues and the very same hurdles, the very same struggles that these people who have left the faith identify as the reasons why they left the faith are the very same ones who don't leave the faith and manage to hold on and stay faithful. They struggle with the same kinds of issues. And so it's helpful, I think, for us to understand what that process of leaving the faith looks like, so that we can maybe avoid setting up those who we disciple, or even our own kids, to have the kind of crisis of faith that for some will lead to them leaving the faith.
Dennis and I have been trying to grapple with discipleship. And one of the common cultural threads within mainstream evangelicalism is to define discipleship primarily as an evangelistic pyramid scheme. And on top of that, to have apologetics as the main tool I have. So if I can beat you into the ground with an argument so that you have no alternative but to say I'm right, that you've got to become a Christian. And when we look at it, a discipleship is really a vocational, all of life thing. I do everything for Christ. And it's in a community where the primary metric for a disciple is the love we have for one another. And when we look at discipleship, the biggest problem we seem to be facing is not recruitment, it's retention. The fact that so many people are walking out. What do you think? I mean, how much of what you've looked at really has to do with the lack of community, the lack of integrity, the institutionalization of the church, moving it away from a community of people who care for one another?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it includes both deconversion, people who walk away, and then the phenomena that we talk about and that we'll address at some point today is the deconstruction phenomenon. Sure. And they aren't necessarily the same thing for our listeners. Deconstruction is a kind of a contested term. I hear it used in a very negative kind of a way. It Sure. describes often people who do end up leaving the faith. Then I hear it on a regular basis amongst Christians who believe that Jesus is the way, but they're not sure what the way of Jesus is supposed to look like anymore. And so they say, I'm deconstructing, but their intention is they want to follow Jesus closer. Sure. And I think a lot of the deconstruction movement is instigated by not just a desire for their own authenticity and to express their individualism and recast Christianity in a way that feels authentic to them. I think that a lot of it is a result of what they've seen go on in the church. I think that probably between the three of us, we could come up with at least 20 names of high-profile Christian evangelical leaders within the last 5 years who have either lost their ministries because of moral failure or spiritual abuse or financial improprieties. And I think when that happens enough to the people who are high profile, and you hear that over and over again in the media, then I think that causes you to maybe rethink what it is that you're part of. I think if you hold to a traditional historic Orthodox position on sexual ethics and you live in the current culture, that you will tend to feel like a bigot because you're not an ally or you're not celebrating the LGBTQ movement. And I think that causes a lot of young people to rethink and ask, is really this what I think the Bible teaches? And sometimes that's done in order to be able to shed biblical teachings, and then sometimes it's done in order to try and remain more faithful. So I do think that there is we could maybe lay at the doorstep of the church some of the reasons, some of the bigger pieces for why people begin to question what it is that they believe, and ultimately some will leave the faith.
John, I was thinking about your book, Anatomy of Deconversion, and folks, by the way, right now you're seeing on the website for johnmarriott.org. This is a fascinating resource John has provided folks so we can think about what is this deconversion we're talking about. And the further deeper you go into his website, you're going to come up on the book we're going to talk about in a minute, Set Adrift, that John has just launched with some guy who keeps walking around with a Spider-Man phone. I don't know who that guy is. But anyway, John has launched this book, Set Adrift, which is going to get us into the conversation about deconstruction. I'm thinking, John, right now, though, again, going back to this idea of deconversion, you seem to suggest sort of 5 silos that may be causative or at least contributive to the problem of deconversion. When you think about the intellectual and the emotional and experiential and the volitional, I'm just wondering, are those strictly internal to the church problems, or is culture on the outside contributing to that as well? What would you tell our folks there?
Well, I think that there's a significant piece that the culture plays. I think that we're shaped and we're squeezed and we're molded in ways that none of us realize by the culture that surrounds us. There's a story, the story of the fish, right? The 2 little fish are swimming, and they come across an older grown-up adult fish, and he says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they look at each other and say, "Fine." And they swim along a little further, and then they say, "What's water?" Right? Because they don't even realize that they're in it. It's just the world that we live in. I think that the culture really squeezes us and shapes us at a gut level, and I'm fairly persuaded that when it comes to moral issues, which I think are a significant driving factor in why people leave the faith, I think that what we feel in our gut impacts what we believe in our minds and causes us to behave in a particular way. So I was speaking at a church. It was Christmas. It was a Christmas event. And a young man came up to me afterwards and said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Tell me what you think about same-sex marriage." And I said, "Well, why don't you tell me what you think about same-sex marriage first?" And I was fascinated by what he said. He pointed to his head and he said, "Up here, I think that it's wrong." But then he pointed down to his heart, stomach area. He said, "But down here, I feel that it isn't, and I feel really bad saying that." And I'm convinced that if I were to find him today and I were to talk with him today, he would probably tell me that he doesn't think that same-sex marriage is wrong up here. Because what's out in the world influences how we feel down here, and what we feel down here, especially when it comes to existential moral issues, impacts what we believe in our minds. And our culture, as it continues to move in the ways that it does, make it, I think, harder and harder to affirm a historic Christian Orthodox position on a number of significant issues. And when you're a young person who everyone around you is asking you whether or not you're binary or whether you're transgendered, I have friends out here in California who just independently over the last year raised the issue of their daughters going to a public high school, and all of her new friends want to know what her pronouns are and whether or not she's going to decide to be a lesbian. And it's so hard for her to say, "Well, no, I'm not going to decide. And in fact, I don't think it's right." So I think we can only live underneath that pressure, for so long for some people, and until it influences the way that they think. And then it's not far from how we think on certain issues until we end up having to give up some of the core pieces.
One of Tim Keller's comments is the culture is catechizing our kids and
100%.
catechizing our lives. What do you sense is the, let's say, non-Christian catechisms that are weighing deformation, conversion influences on the kids around you in the Christian schools? Surely, if we can talk about what's really leveraging them from a secular standpoint, we can say it's probably only more pressure in the non-Christian context. But what do you hear kids really looking to for meaning and identity and purpose outside of the church?
Well, I think one of the most significant themes that they encounter, that the scripts that they're given to live by, is that they need to be authentic to themselves. Right? Mm-hmm. Their duty, their obligation is not necessarily to something that's placed on them by society. There's no grand narrative or no story out there that's objectively true about the world. All there is competing collective hunches. Christians think this is the story. Marxists think that this is the story. And we can't ever know the story. Everyone's has a different opinion. So why, if a lot of these stories might just turn out to be social constructs, and those who have the most power can make their social construct seem like it's the one that you should fit into its mold. But if that's not true, if there's no story that reflects objective truth, that the world has a structure, that there are metaphysical truths and principles out there, then why, if I live one time and one time only, should I ever conform myself to living and restricting myself to someone else's social construct? And not only are we unwilling to submit ourselves to someone's social construct about the nature of reality, because there's no supposed objective truth there, we're now even being taught, and young people are being invited even to question the objective nature of their own bodies, that it isn't even a determinative factor in how they should identify when it comes to their gender. And so therefore, the book written by Tom Brokaw a number of years ago called The Greatest Generation, he talks about why the greatest generation, born in the late 1920s, he says they went off to war, they fought the Nazis, they liberated the free world, then they came home and they built the greatest country economically and militarily the world has ever seen. And he says the reason why they did that is because they were committed to loyalty, faith, duty, and honor. And all of those are to something else, to something greater than themselves. They believed that they had a role to fulfill, that there was a function that they needed to accomplish, that there was real objective truth out there, and they were going to live and pour into that. But when you get rid of the idea that there is a way to be, then all that you're left with is being authentic to yourself. And so we hear things like, speak your truth. No one said that even 10 years ago. People said, well, that's your belief, this is my belief. But no one ever said that's your truth. We hear things like, live your best life now, and you be you, and you do you. And almost every movie that comes out is a script given to adolescents where the hero of the story is the one who overcomes the expectations and the responsibilities placed on them by others so that they can be authentically who they are in and of themselves. And if you want an example of that, watch the movie Turning Red, watch the movie The Little Mermaid, High School Musical. All of those are telling young people that the only person that they have any responsibility towards is towards being their authentic selves.
Okay, this is part one, The Anatomy of Deconversion. John Marriott telling us what it means to be a deconvert in Christianity. When we come back in part two, we'll be talking with John about his new book, Set Adrift, and the concept of deconstruction, Christian deconstruction, and deconstructing your faith entirely. It's not always a bad thing. Stay with us in part two, coming out next week, with John Marriott on The Disciple Dilemma. Thanks for listening.